So Here was directed by Robert Zemeckis, stars Tom Hanks, Robin Wright, and Paul Bettany. And in this movie, taking place over the course of several years and such, to say the least, various events occur in this one location: love, life, loss, happiness, sadness, everything that happens in this one location, life happens in this one spot over the course of several years. So this was a movie that I was kind of intrigued by, but also not intrigued by. I was kind of intrigued because the trailer kind of looked a little interesting. I was kind of interested to see how this whole gimmick would kind of work out. Like everything's kind of happening in this one location and such. And I was kind of interested too because Robert Zemeckis is not only reteaming with Tom Hanks, which he's reteamed with Tom Hanks over the years, but he's also reteaming with Robin Wright from Forrest Gump. He was also co-wrote this movie with Eric Roth, who wrote Forrest Gump. Also, Alan Silvestri did the music for this movie. So yeah, it's a Forrest Gump reunion, 30 years in the making. And I was definitely kind of curious to see what this movie was going to be like. I didn't expect it to be great because, admittedly, I'm not a fan of Robert Zemeckis as of late. Yes, he's made a ton of great movies in his career: Forrest Gump, Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Castaway. He knows how to make great movies. And it shocks me that within the last decade, he has not made a really good movie. Like, they kind of just got worse and worse to just plain old unbearable. Like, Welcome to Marwen, The Witches. I don't even want to talk about Pinocchio, but I'm hoping this movie is actually decent. And having seen it, I can say, no, this is not good. This is shockingly bad. Shockingly bad. It's not like it's offensively bad by any means, but given the talent involved, this movie should have been a lot better. But I will be fair and talk about some of the things I do like in this movie. First off, the presentation itself is kind of interesting, how it is mostly in just one location for its entire movie, and how it kind of like changes throughout the entire movie. They have like these windows. At first I thought it was like picture frames that kind of like went into like, other timelines, like either went back in time or went forward in time. It's like, okay, this is where this is happening and such. I thought it was interesting at first, and I realized, oh, those are actually windows. That makes a lot more sense. It's a house. But that was kind of interesting. At times it kind of wore off a bit, but I'm going to talk about that. And I do think the acting is at least fine. Like, there's no bad performance in this movie per se. Like, Tom Hanks, he's usually decent. He's really good. He's decent in this movie. Robin Wright, decent. Paul Bettany, decent. Again, there's no bad performance in this movie per se. Just pretty much everything else about this movie is bad. Let's talk about the connections to the stories. I feel like they were just very thin. I felt like they didn't really matter to me. Like, there were so many moments where they kind of like try to loosely connect the stories together to kind of show, like, the more things change, the more they wind up staying the same. And, you've heard that line many times, and it's just dull at this point. It's amazing that, a filmmaker who's been making films for over 40 years is like, no, I'm gonna make that the main thing of my movie. Like, that's gonna be the main message. It's like, oh, great, something that you would hear from any random person on the street. Great, great. And this movie is also very Forrest Gump light. And what I mean by that is not just because a lot of people who were associated with that movie are involved with this movie, but this movie also tries to tie in a lot of historical events. And some of them are pretty random. Again, they try to tie in some of them in some way, like, oh, this character, he died during the 1920s pandemic, which would correspond with someone dying in the 2020 pandemic. Very thin right there. There's also some references to various other things that kind of happened throughout throughout history and such, ranging from the extinction of dinosaurs to Ben Franklin's illegitimate son to again, the pandemics and such, to the invention of the lazy boy chair, to talking about some protests that also happened in 2020. This movie talks about a lot. And it kind of references a lot of things, like a lot of historical events. It's kind of amazing that this movie is kind of hypocritical in that sense. Like, it's like, a lot of ordinary things can happen in this one location. But here are a lot of historical events that happened in this one location. That itself is just very uninteresting. That is just very hypocritical, in my opinion. One of the reasons why we liked Forrest Gump so much wasn't because, he goes through like all these historical events. It's about a man who goes through like a lot of these historical events, but how they kind of shape the world around him and kind of how they shape him and such. And that itself is very interesting. The characters themselves in this movie are incredibly thin. Like, I couldn't even care about anyone in this movie. Whether that's, any of the storylines, I could not care about whatsoever. I could not care about Tom Hanks and his character storyline, which that's probably the main storyline in this movie, because like they kind of go through a lot of stuff, but there's definitely puzzle pieces missing. A lot of the segments in this movie feel like they're just vignettes rather than like an actual story that's happening. It feels weird because like there's so much stuff that's kind of like happening and you kind of have to put the pieces together yourself, which is like it's not like it's like that difficult to put together, but it's just so very thin. It just kind of comes out of nowhere, which I won't spoil them by any means, but it's just definitely feels like they're more performing scenes rather than like acting out a story. And that's kind of annoying. The best way to describe this movie is like, well, imagine the song "We Didn't Start the Fire." Admittedly, not a good song in my opinion. I say it as a Billy Joel fan, it's not a good song. Um, Forrest Gump is like the original Billy Joel version. And this version is the Fall Out Boy version, where a lot of stuff is just completely out of order and it's just completely random. A lot of it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. That's this movie. It's completely random, it's completely out of order, and you're just kind of like trying to put the puzzle pieces together. It's like, why did you think this was a good idea, really? And also, a lot of the sentiment just feels really fake. I could not care about anything that happened in this movie. Like, there are so many things that kind of happened in this movie that admittedly have kind of happened to me in real life, but because again, we don't really know too much about these characters other than they're going through these situations without really saying why they're going through the situations to begin with, that is not very interesting. You don't really do anything with it other than just say, hey, this character is going through this, feel bad. Well, you didn't give me enough time to make me care for your character enough to make me feel bad. So why should I feel bad? And again, a lot of the historical references are just very random. At least I can kind of understand why some of the ones are mentioned in Forrest Gump. But like this one is just very random. Like one of the storylines involves the Lazy Boy chair being put together in this place, and it takes them a while to figure out the name Lazy Boy. And in fact, they don't figure it out until at least an hour into this movie. Which, by the way, this movie's only an hour 45. So yeah, great storyline there. And also, I do want to talk about one other thing, and that's the whole gimmick of, the one location. At first, I was kind of intrigued because it's like, oh, it's kind of in one location and such, so how are they going to do this? And admittedly, at first, it was kind of interesting, but the gimmick wore off after a while. Because to me, like at times, they would constantly like leave the scene, but then kind of still talk about what's going on and such, and then come back into the shot and such. And it was just weird at times. Like, I did not care for it after a while. It kind of just wore off its welcome. There's nothing wrong with a movie trying to have a gimmick, but you still have to have interesting characters. You still have to have an interesting story. You still have to do interesting things. Like, Birdman and 1917 were shot and edited to make it look like it was all done in one shot. That being said, Birdman had interesting characters. It had funny dialogue, and it was actually really well done. 1917 is intense throughout, and it just builds and builds and builds. So the fact that you're kind of trapped in this one spot, technically, it's effective. This movie is not very effective with its gimmick. It's just a gimmick. It's just it's trying hard, but not hard enough at the same time. Also, side note, a lot of people kind of laughed at a lot of inappropriate things in this movie, and I don't know if it was intentional or not. Like, there's one scene where a kid gets hurt, and a lot of people laughed, and I'm like, how are people laughing at this? This is horrifying. That's not funny. Like, why are people laughing at a kid getting hurt? I don't get it. And some people, I kind of heard some people say, oh, this is different and such, which means they didn't like it either. They probably all went to see this movie because like, oh, Tom Hanks is in it, so let's go give this movie a chance. Well, I still try to give this movie a chance because, again, Robert Zemeckis has made incredible films, but he's just gone off the deep end. Like, a lot of his movies just fall flat. Like, they aren't as fun as they used to be. They aren't as interesting as they used to be. They aren't as entertaining. They're just kind of jokes in the worst possible way. And this movie, I feel like this movie won't be as bad of a joke as something like, say, Pinocchio, but this is a movie where I'm like, I just look at it and I'm like, everyone involved in this movie is talented, from the director to the actors to pretty much everyone associated with the movie. And I'm just like, why did you do that? Why did you do this? So even though the presentation itself is interesting, and admittedly there are no bad performances in the movie per se, pretty much everything else just feels off for some reason. The connections to the stories are not very interesting. The stories themselves are not very interesting. The fact that it is a Forrest Gump ripoff done by people who did Forrest Gump feels off. The whole connection to We Didn't Start the Fire, again, Forrest Gump Light, that's kind of weird to me. Like, I compared it to that, and I feel like it makes more sense than anything you will see in this movie. And also, the sentiment, the very emotional moments don't feel earned, and the gimmick just wore its welcome by the end of the movie. I did not care for Here. It is not a good movie. It's just, it's a movie that thinks it's being well intentioned, but winds up not being there. Again, everything just feels off about this movie to the point where I'm just like, no. The only way I can potentially see this something like this work is if it was like kind of a play and like all the storylines are kind of like on stage at various points. That would have been kind of interesting. But instead, I feel like they tried too hard to make something big and epic and grand and such, and it winds up just feeling hollow. And I think that's the worst part of it. I will give Here. I'm gonna be very low on this. I'm gonna give it 1 out of 4 stars. Skip it. So, who's a director that you used to like, but nowadays you don't really care for? Whatever the reason, comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat, and stay safe.